How the US debt spiral could spark a crisis. It is a number so massive it feels fictional. $37 trillion. That is the current size of the United States' national debt, and it's growing by the day. To put that in perspective, if you saved $1 million every single day, it would take you 100,000 years to reach $37 trillion. But this isn't some theoretical number. It's real. And it's reshaping not just US fiscal policy, but the global economic order. This financial milestone has become a global talking point after President Donald Trump signed what he proudly named the Big Beautiful Budget Bill into law in July 4th, 2025. The bill, which includes sweeping tax cuts, is expected to add another $3 trillion to the national debt. Supporters of the bill argue that these tax cuts will stimulate economic growth, boost business investment, and put more money into the hands of working Americans. Proponents believe that lowering the corporate tax rate will make the US more competitive globally, encourage companies to expand domestically, and ultimately lead to job creation and higher tax revenues in the long run. Some view it as a necessary jolt for an economy that has been slowing under inflationary pressures and rising interest rates. However, the bill has also stirred intense criticism from economists, investors, and even some of Trump's former allies like Elon Musk, who called it a disgusting abomination. Critics warn that the added debt could lead to higher borrowing costs, reduced government flexibility in future crises, and a potential erosion of confidence in US fiscal responsibility. There are also fears that if economic growth doesn't outpace the rise in debt, the country could face long-term fiscal instability. In short, while the bill is hailed by some as a bold economic catalyst, others see it as a dangerous gamble with America's financial future. While opinions remain divided on whether the Big Beautiful Bill will ignite growth or deepen the debt crisis, one thing is clear. The stakes have never been higher. To understand how we arrived at this critical point, we need to look beyond the headlines and explore the mechanics of America's long-standing debt dilemma. How did we get here? The US government operates at a deficit, meaning it spends more than it earns through taxes and other revenues. Every year, that difference must be made up by borrowing, which adds to the national debt. As interest on the debt accumulates, it becomes harder to reduce the deficit. It's a cycle that feeds itself. Ray Dalio, the founder of the world's largest hedge fund, recently sounded the alarm. According to Dalio, the US could soon be spending $10 trillion a year just on debt interest repayments. He warned, the government's financial condition is at an inflection point. If this is not dealt with now, the debts will build up to levels where they can't be managed without great trauma. The question that economists, policymakers, and everyday Americans are now asking is, how much debt is too much debt? At what point does national debt become not just a concern, but a crisis? And are we already there? Debt in context. To determine how much debt is too much, we first need to understand how national debt is measured. Economists don't just look at the raw dollar amount, massive though it may be, but at debt as a percentage of gross domestic product, GDP. This ratio allows us to see whether a nation's economy is strong enough to support its borrowing. Right now, the US national debt sits at $37 trillion, and it's on track to exceed 115% of GDP within a few years if current trends continue. For reference, during the height of World War II, a time of all-out global conflict, the US debt to GDP ratio peaked around 119%. The difference today is that we're not in a world war. We're in a time of relative peace in comparison to World War II, yet borrowing like we're in a crisis. Historically, economists have considered a debt to GDP ratio above 90% to be a red flag. Once debt crosses that threshold, it tends to drag on economic growth. This was the conclusion reached by Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff in a widely debated 2010 study. Although some of their findings have been challenged, the principle holds true. excessive debt can become a weight on national productivity, innovation, and private investment. So if 90% is a danger zone and the US is already well past that point, are we already in crisis? There's no single magic number where debt becomes too much. Instead, it depends on a combination of factors: interest rates, investor confidence, economic growth, and political stability. But there is a tipping point, and the warning signs are mounting. One major concern is the rising cost of servicing the debt. As interest rates increase, so does the cost of paying back what has already been borrowed. The US is now projected to spend over $1 trillion annually just on interest payments. That's more than what's allocated for defense, education, or infrastructure. If trends hold, interest payments will soon become the single largest line item in the federal budget. This is deeply troubling. When a government is forced to spend a growing share of its revenue just to cover interest without touching the principal, it severely limits its ability to respond to a new crisis. Whether it's a recession, a war, a pandemic, or a natural disaster, fiscal flexibility vanishes. And then there are the black swan events, rare, unpredictable shocks that no model or forecast sees coming, but that change everything overnight. History shows that these events do happen. The 2008 financial crash, triggered by collapse in subprime mortgages, was a black swan that sent global markets into freefall. The COVID-19 pandemic was another, paralyzing the world economy almost instantly. In a system already strained by $37 trillion in debt, it wouldn't take much: an unexpected geopolitical conflict, a cyber attack on the financial system, a sudden loss of confidence in US Treasury bonds, for the situation to spiral. That's the danger with running this close to the edge. You don't just need a slow-moving trend to unravel it all. It could collapse by tomorrow. Another risk of excessive debt is that it could trigger a loss of confidence among investors. The US government borrows by issuing Treasury bonds, which are typically viewed as one of the safest investments in the world. But if investors begin to doubt America's ability or willingness to repay its debt, that perception could change quickly. This loss of confidence is already beginning to show in the bond markets. The yield curve has steepened, indicating that investors are demanding higher interest rates to lend for the long term. This is a clear signal that the market is nervous. If that nervousness turns into panic, the government could face a situation where it must offer even higher rates just to attract buyers for its bonds. That would spiral the debt further, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. And it wouldn't just be the government that suffers. Higher interest rates affect mortgage rates, car loans, credit cards, and business lending. The entire economy would feel the pinch. Some defenders of America's debt argue that other countries are also heavily indebted. Japan, for example, has a debt-to-GDP ratio of over 260%. But Japan is a very different case. Its debt is largely held domestically. Its interest rates are near zero, and its population is unusually tolerant of government borrowing. The US, by contrast, relies heavily on foreign investment. Countries like China and Japan and institutional investors around the world purchase US debt. If those creditors decide to reduce their exposure, or worse, sell off holdings, it could trigger a currency crisis or financial shock. Moreover, the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, and that status depends on global trust in America's fiscal and political stability. If that trust is lost, the consequences could be catastrophic. One of the biggest dangers right now isn't just the size of the debt, but the attitude towards it. For years, both political parties have grown comfortable with deficit spending. Programs are expanded, taxes are cut, and a few are willing to make tough choices to restore balance. In the short term, this may not seem like a problem. After all, the US government has never defaulted on its debt. But long-term debt accumulation without a credible plan for repayment sends a dangerous message. It tells future generations, we borrowed for our needs and left you to pay the bill. That's not just bad economics, it's morally irresponsible. What could trigger a crisis? While debt accumulation happens gradually, crises tend to come suddenly. A few plausible triggers could include a global recession that forces the US to borrow even more to stimulate the economy, a geopolitical event such as a conflict in the Taiwan Strait or Middle East that disrupts global markets and drives up borrowing needs, a sharp rise in interest rates, possibly triggered by inflation or central bank tightening, a political standoff in Congress, such as the failure to raise the debt ceiling or pass a budget which shakes investor confidence. Any of these could push the US from the edge of the cliff to a full-blown fiscal crisis. What needs to change? Avoiding a debt crisis will require bold, bipartisan action, something that has become increasingly rare in Washington. Solutions could include reforming entitlement programs to ensure long-term sustainability, revisiting tax policy, including closing loopholes and potentially raising revenues, reducing non-essential spending across government departments, establishing a long-term fiscal commission with the authority to propose binding solutions. None of these options are politically easy, but continued inaction is far worse. So, how much debt is too much? The honest answer is we're getting dangerously close to finding out. The current path is unsustainable, not in theory, but in practice. Each year of delay makes the eventual reckoning more painful. Debt in itself is not inherently bad. Used wisely, it can finance growth, protect the vulnerable, and respond to emergencies. But when debt becomes a substitute for hard choices, when it becomes a way to avoid responsibility, that's when it turns toxic. We are at a crossroads. Either we face the reality of our fiscal condition now, or we wait until reality forces itself upon us. One way leads to painful reform, the other leads to crisis. If you found this video eye-opening, don't forget to like, share, and most importantly, subscribe for more in-depth breakdowns of the biggest issues shaping our world. We're just getting started. The signs are there. Stay informed, stay alert, and stay ready.